The Old West we imagine, fast-draw duels, hair-trigger tempers, and six-shooters blazing at every turn, is a world shaped more by Hollywood than by history. But the truth? It's far stranger, far grittier, and far more shocking than most people realize. From the way guns were actually carried to how rarely true shootouts happened, nearly everything we think we know has been twisted by time and storytelling. Today, we're peeling back the myths to uncover the real world of frontier firearms, one where skill, survival, and sheer practicality mattered more than style. If you love uncovering the truth behind Old West legends, make sure to leave a comment below and subscribe to the channel. There's a whole frontier of forgotten history waiting for you. The phrase Old West instantly brings certain pictures to mind. We tend to imagine dusty main streets, prospectors bent over streams, long lines of cattle, wooden pueblos, and cowboys with six-shooters on their hips in small frontier towns. Towns like Tombstone, Deadwood, and Dodge City have become symbols of that entire era. Today, the word cowboy is often used as a compliment. It suggests independence, toughness, and a personal code of honor tied to preserving the spirit and traditions of the American West. But historically, that reputation is much more complicated. The term cowboy only started becoming common in the 1870s, and in many places at that time it did not have a flattering meaning. In certain regions, especially along the border, cowboy was used as a slang term for cattle raiders and troublemakers, rather than heroic ranch hands. Groups of these riders crossed from the United States into Mexico, took cattle from Mexican ranchos without permission, and then drove the herds back north to sell in U.S. markets. Some historians see these loosely organized bands of rustlers as an early form of coordinated criminal activity, one of the first recognizable organized crime systems in American history, even if it was far less structured than what that phrase suggests today. Where there were disputes over property, borders, and cattle, there were also firearms. Many people on all sides, ranchers, settlers, merchants, travelers, and law officers, owned guns as everyday tools for protection, hunting, and safeguarding their livelihoods. Some argue that crime followed the spread of firearms. Others believe firearms were simply a response to already dangerous or unstable conditions. Whatever your perspective on modern gun debates, whether you strongly support gun ownership, strongly oppose it, or fall somewhere in the middle, one fact is clear. Firearms have been deeply woven into American life since the earliest colonial days, well before the Second Amendment was written and adopted. They were part of the reality of the Old West long before they became symbols in movies, novels, and modern political arguments. Guns in the Old West become a focus to reduce crime. In an effort to maintain order in the fast-growing frontier town of Tombstone, Arizona territory, local officials introduced a regulation designed to manage the carrying of personal weapons. Under this rule, anyone arriving with items such as a Bowie knife, a dirk, a small pocket knife, a pistol, or a rifle was required to check their equipment at a livery stable or saloon shortly after entering town. This measure was formalized in Ordinance Number 9, a city law focused on limiting the public display of certain weapons. Its purpose was not to disarm citizens permanently, but to create a safer environment within the town limits, especially as Tombstone expanded rapidly in the early 1880s. Section 1 made it illegal for anyone to carry specific weapons within the city unless they had written permission. This reflected a common trend across many frontier towns, where local leaders tried to balance personal freedom with community safety. Section 2 clarified that travelers passing through the city were not expected to be fully without their equipment. Instead, they were given a reasonable amount of time and flexibility to turn in or retrieve their items from an approved storage location. Section 3 stated clearly that all types of firearms, along with Bowie knives and dirks, were included under the ordinance. This broad definition ensured that the law applied consistently, regardless of the style or size of the weapon. Historically, Tombstone's Ordinance Number 9 demonstrates that many Old West towns use local regulations to encourage peaceful daily life. Contrary to popular imagery, frontier communities often relied on structured rules, not constant conflict, to keep busy streets and booming mining camps functioning smoothly. A local ordinance in practice. This ordinance played a central role in City Marshal Virgil Earp's choice to step in during the events leading up to the well-known confrontation near the OK Corral. His actions were based on enforcing Tombstone's local law, which required certain weapons to be checked upon entering town. In recent years, some commentators have pointed to these Old West regulations as examples that might guide modern discussions about crime and public safety. However, applying frontier-era laws to today's circumstances can be misleading, especially when suggesting that removing personal weapons from society automatically creates greater security. Many frontier towns did have rules regarding weapons, but these measures rarely involved removing them from private citizens or restricting specific types of guns. More commonly, regulations focused on how weapons could be used, for example, limiting the firing of guns within busy streets or crowded business districts. These kinds of guidelines would not seem controversial to most people today, including those who generally oppose broad gun restrictions. Yet even these limited rules were not widespread across the United States at the time. They appeared mostly in fast-growing mining towns or cattle centers where officials were trying to reduce disorder and maintain public calm. Even in the Old West, such ordinances were relatively rare, and their effectiveness varied. Tombstone's own experience shows that local laws alone could not prevent tension or conflict. This suggests that using isolated frontier regulations as models for current national debates oversimplifies the far more complex social issues involved, both then and now. Gun control measures at the OK Corral. The event known as the gunfight at the OK Corral lasted only about half a minute, yet it became one of the most iconic moments in Old West history. It occurred around 3 p.m. on Wednesday, October 26, 1881, in Tombstone, Arizona territory, and involved local law officers on one side and members of a loosely connected group often referred to as the Cochise County Cowboys on the other. Although the moment itself was brief, it grew out of months of tension. Conflicts over politics, business, cattle, and law enforcement had been building between the Cowboys and Tombstone's officials. These disputes eventually brought both groups face to face in the narrow lot near the rear entrance of the OK Corral. When the confrontation was over, 3 members of the cowboy faction had lost their lives, while others left the scene quickly as the situation unfolded. The law officers were also harmed to varying degrees, except for Wyatt Earp, who walked away without injury. Wyatt Earp is frequently portrayed as the main figure in this historic incident. However, this impression is somewhat misleading. His older brother Virgil Earp was the city marshal of Tombstone and a deputy U.S. Marshal at the time, making him the ranking officer in charge. Virgil brought years of experience as a constable, marshal, sheriff, and Civil War soldier. From a historical standpoint, he, not Wyatt, was the primary authority responsible for enforcing the town's ordinances and managing the unfolding conflict on that day. An open range for outlaws. The famous clash near the OK Corral has come to symbolize a time in the Old West when large stretches of the frontier offered wide freedom of movement to people on both sides of the law. Sheriffs, marshals, and deputies often had to cover enormous distances with limited resources, which made consistent enforcement difficult. Interestingly, this particular incident was not widely known to the broader American public right away. Its fame grew much later, especially after a well-received biography of Wyatt Earp appeared in 1931. That book helped transform the event into a national story. From that point on, the confrontation has been retold in countless Western movies, novels, and popular histories, sometimes sticking close to documented facts, sometimes taking extensive dramatic liberties. Over time, it has become a template for how many people picture the Wild West: tense showdowns, dusty streets, and strong personalities facing off in frontier towns. When it comes to regulations on weapons in the Old West, the historical record shows a more nuanced picture than many modern debates suggest. Where such rules existed, they generally did not involve taking guns away from citizens permanently or limiting particular models or calibers. Instead, many frontier towns, Tombstone among them, focused on where and how weapons could be carried. Local ordinances often made it against the law to carry certain types of arms openly within town limits unless the person had obtained a written permit. Visitors were typically expected to check in their weapons shortly after arriving. These policies created what some historians describe as early forms of restricted carry zones in certain 19th century towns. However, evidence suggests that such measures had only limited impact on reducing serious disputes or armed confrontations. In Tombstone's case, some researchers even argue that the attempt to enforce these rules added fuel to existing tensions and played a part in the chain of events that led to the famous encounter near the OK Corral. Many guns, not much crime. Episodes like the one at the OK Corral were dramatic, but they were not everyday occurrences. Large, highly publicized armed clashes were relatively rare on the frontier, even if later movies and television shows made them seem routine. Overall, the Old West's reputation as a place of constant disorder is exaggerated. While some towns did see periods with a higher number of deaths from personal disputes, many types of serious crime were less common than people might assume. Historical research suggests that offenses such as sexual assault and robbery occurred at lower rates in many Western communities than in the United States of the late 20th century, particularly during the crime peaks of the 1970s and 1980s. It is also important to note that nationwide, both overall crime and gun-related crime have dropped significantly since the 1990s, even as the number of privately owned firearms has grown. That pattern complicates simple explanations that link the presence of guns directly to higher crime levels. In the Old West, the incidents that did occur most often grew out of personal disputes, usually involving young men. Alcohol played a major role. Arguments that might have remained verbal sometimes escalated when individuals had been drinking heavily. Because of this, some frontier towns responded by placing limits on when and where weapons could be carried or used, especially in areas with many saloons. These local rules reflected a practical attempt to keep everyday disagreements from turning into more serious and tragic outcomes. Crime in Old West towns. Historian Robert McGrath, who studied crime in some of the most well-known frontier towns, found that many offenses people associate with the Old West were actually uncommon. According to his research, robbery, theft, and burglary happen infrequently, and crimes such as bank robbery, sexual assault, racial attacks, and serious juvenile offenses were either extremely rare or not recorded at all. McGrath did note that the number of fatal encounters was higher than in many other periods, but these incidents almost always stemmed from disputes between individuals who willingly engaged in the conflict. They were not typically acts of predation against unsuspecting victims, but rather personal quarrels that escalated. The few regulations aimed at managing weapons in the Old West were often applied unevenly. In many cases, town rules existed on paper, but were not strongly enforced. This inconsistency was partly due to the reality that frontier law enforcement officers had limited jurisdiction, limited manpower, and enormous areas to cover. McGrath argued that the widespread ownership of firearms served as a meaningful deterrent in these communities. Because formal law enforcement could not be everywhere, personal ownership of weapons was viewed as a necessary layer of protection, both for individuals and for the settlement as a whole. This perspective contrasts with some modern commentary, which emphasizes that today's law enforcement presence is much broader, and therefore personal weapons may not be as necessary for day-to-day safety. Setting that debate aside, one fact about the Old West is clear. Firearm ownership was nearly universal. It was understood as a practical tool for safeguarding oneself, supporting the community, and navigating a world where formal authorities could not always respond quickly. In many ways, that belief in personal responsibility and preparedness continues to influence discussions about safety and self-reliance today. The guns in the Old West. People often say that guns were everywhere in the Old West, and in this case, the popular belief aligns closely with historical reality. Firearms were a common part of daily life for ranchers, travelers, settlers, and law officers alike. This raises a natural question. What kinds of firearms did people actually use on the frontier? In other words, what were the smoke wagons, as some called them, that helped shape the American West? Popular culture often celebrates the Winchester Model 1873 as the defining frontier firearm. It certainly earned an important place in history. The reliable lever-action design was used in military engagements, range disputes, and by countless ranchers protecting their land and livestock. But the truth is more complex. No single firearm can honestly claim to have won the West. Instead, a wide variety of revolvers, rifles, and shotguns played vital roles across the region. People carried everything from cutting-edge repeating arms to older single-shot models, representing nearly every major design, caliber, and manufacturer of the time. Although no one gun stands above all others, several models clearly had an outsized influence. Certain six-shooters, repeating rifles, and dependable shotguns became essential tools for work, travel, and personal security. With that in mind, here are 4 firearms from the Old West era that truly deserve attention. Many other models left a meaningful mark on frontier history, but these stand out as some of the most significant. Colt Single Action Army. Few firearms are as closely linked to the image of the Old West as the Colt Single Action Army. First introduced in 1873 as a revolver for the U.S. cavalry, it quickly found its way across the frontier and became one of the most recognizable sidearms of the era. More cowboys, ranch hands, travelers, law officers, and well-known frontier figures carried this Colt than almost any other revolver of the period. Individuals such as Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, John Selman, and John Wesley Hardin were among those who preferred it, and for understandable reasons. The single-action army had excellent balance, comfortable handling, and a smooth, reliable action. Its design allowed the revolver to rise slightly in the hand after each shot, naturally positioning the user to cock the hammer for the next round, a feature that made it efficient and intuitive to operate. It was also known for strong performance, especially in its popular chamberings of 44-40 Winchester and 45 Colt. These cartridges provided the power and accuracy frontier users expected for everyday tasks, including protection, ranch work, and long-distance travel. The Colt SAA was not without limitations. Reloading was slow, and safety practices of the time meant most owners carried only 5 rounds, leaving the hammer resting on an empty chamber. In a demanding situation, these factors could make the revolver slower to bring back into use. Even so, in skilled hands, and there were many on the frontier, the Colt Single-Action Army earned a lasting reputation as one of the most dependable and influential handguns of the American West. Henry 1860. Although it was not produced in massive numbers, the 1860 Henry rifle proved highly effective during the Civil War. Its repeating design gave those who used it a clear advantage in terms of sustained fire. That advantage appeared again in one of the most studied battles in American history, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, equipped with Henry rifles and other repeating firearms, faced the 7th U.S. Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Archaeological research from the battlefield suggests that Native warriors may have had around 134 firearms of various types, with roughly 62 of them identified as Henry rifles. This indicates a significant number of repeaters in indigenous hands. By contrast, most of Custer's troopers carried single-shot Springfield Model 1873 rifles. These fired copper cartridges that were known to expand in the chamber, sometimes causing extraction problems and slowing the rate of fire. Taken together, this evidence suggests that on that late June day in 1876, Custer and his men faced not only a larger opposing force, but also a substantial disadvantage in terms of how quickly and reliably their weapons could be brought into action. Winchester Model 1873, widely regarded as one of the most recognizable rifles of the Old West, the Winchester Model 1873 has become a true symbol of the frontier era. Its sturdy iron frame and lever-action design made it practical both in a saddle scabbard and at a homestead. The 1873 served as a reliable tool for tasks that a revolver could not easily manage. Many well-known figures of the period, including William F. Buffalo Bill Cody, members of the Texas Rangers, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, and numerous other Western personalities, are documented as having used this rifle. Part of the Model 1873's success came from its ease of use and relatively low maintenance requirements. This meant that a person could often use the same ammunition in both a revolver and a rifle, greatly simplifying life in a time when supply chains were unpredictable. Delays, shortages, or lost shipments of ammunition could cause real difficulties on the frontier, so being able to rely on a single caliber for multiple firearms was a major benefit. By the late 19th century, the Model 1873 had become widespread across the American West, with roughly 500,000 rifles produced before 1900. Owning one became almost a mark of practicality and preparedness for many law officers, ranchers, and settlers. Today, while modern rifles have taken its place in everyday use, the spirit of the 1873 lives on in contemporary lever-action designs that still appeal to those who appreciate their history, reliability, and connection to the Old West. Double-barreled shotgun. The Winchester Model 1873 rifle and the Colt single Action Army were widely used across the frontier, but even these famous firearms were probably outnumbered by the simple double-barreled shotgun. This straightforward, dependable gun accompanied countless pioneers as they traveled west in search of new opportunities. Double-barreled shotguns came from many countries and manufacturers. Some were even crafted in small blacksmith shops. Their popularity made sense. Shotguns were versatile tools, well suited for life on the frontier. They could be used for gathering food, whether the target was game with fur or birds in flight. Their broad utility made them one of the most practical firearms a settler could own. They also became standard equipment for many local law officers and were commonly issued to stagecoach guards, especially in the shortened coach gun configuration. This compact version was easier to handle in tight quarters and proved its value on long, unpredictable travel routes. At the same time, the shotgun's accessibility meant that it was carried by people from all walks of life, some using it for honest work and others for less admirable purposes. Its widespread presence underscores how deeply firearms were woven into everyday routines during westward expansion. Whether someone prefers the iconic lever-action rifles, classic revolvers, or straightforward double-barreled shotguns, one fact is clear. Firearms played a significant role in shaping frontier life and the movement of settlers across the continent. And, as modern debates show, many people still view personal firearms as an important part of contemporary American culture and identity. The truth is, the American frontier was far more complex than the tall tales we grew up hearing. Guns were tools, symbols, necessities, and sometimes problems, but they were never the Hollywood props we see on screen. Behind every revolver or rifle was a real person trying to survive a challenging landscape, make a living, or carve out a future in a world that was still finding its footing. And when we look past the myths, the real story of the Old West becomes even more fascinating. If you enjoyed exploring the reality behind these legends, make sure to leave a comment below and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these forgotten stories alive, and there's a whole frontier of history waiting for our next adventure together.